listener production.
Hello, welcome to The Briefing. I'm Sasha Barbagat. Should the census ask if you're gay? The 2021 census didn't, leaving many LGBTQI+ Australians hurt, disappointed, and feeling unseen by their government.
Times are changing. Young people are doing a great job in talking about sexual orientation and gender. And over time in society, we will look back in the future on this decision and wonder why on earth it was made.
So, should the government be counting our sexuality in the census? Bension interviews the head of LGBTIQ+ Health Australia in the second half of this episode. First though, let's get into the headlines with Helen Smith. It's Tuesday, the 27th of August.
Morning, Sasha. Ceasefire talks between Israel and Hamas have progressed, according to a US mediator. Both sides have been refusing to budge on key details over the last few months, including whether Israel should have an ongoing military presence in Gaza. Now, the so-called nuts and bolts of the deal are being analysed, signalling progress has been made, but an actual deal is still far from being locked in. It comes as a new survey by The Guardian finds a majority of Australians agree with the opposition leaders' calls to pause immigration from Gaza. Peter Dutton has spent the last 2 weeks ramping up the rhetoric around the safety of Palestinian refugees entering the country, saying not enough checks are being carried out to ensure they don't sympathise with Hamas.
Yeah, last night Treasurer Jim Chalmers, in a speech in Melbourne, labelled Dutton, quote, the most divisive leader, end quote, in Australia's history. And that is all over these comments he's made about refugees coming from Gaza. But this recent poll did find 44% of Aussies agree that we should pause visas to people from Gaza, and that's compared to 30% who opposed the move. 26% of respondents to this poll were undecided. Now, it's worth noting this was 1,129 voters that were quizzed at the end of a pretty tense parliamentary sitting week last week. There are some other interesting tidbits from this poll that I thought would be worth pointing out. Support for immigration in general is quite finely balanced. So equally, 42% of respondents described it as generally positive or generally negative for Australia. So we're split right down the middle on that one. While respondents were also quizzed on how they felt about Israel's military action in Gaza. So 39% of people called on Israel to permanently withdraw. There was 17% who said Israel's action is justified. 21% want a temporary ceasefire, and a quarter, 24%, were unsure. So some interesting little insights there, I think, into how at least this group of Australians are feeling about what's going on in Gaza and immigration in Australia.
The captain of the luxury yacht that sank off the coast of Sicily, killing 7, including British tech tycoon Mike Lynch, has been placed under investigation for charges of manslaughter and shipwreck. The New Zealand man was in charge of the 56-metre vessel carrying 22 passengers when a freak storm hit in the early hours last Monday. His lawyers said he is deeply affected by this ordeal. But experts are still baffled by how fast the yacht sank, which was within 60 seconds. Investigators are alleging that the crew might have underestimated the storm, leaving a hatch open on the boat, which could have caused the vessel to sink rapidly. Now, it's important to note that being put under investigation in Italy does not imply guilt, and there have been no formal charges laid either. Other crew members may also be questioned and put under investigation as well.
Australians right across the country have been enjoying a very warm end to winter, and now a new record has been set. The hottest ever winter temperature was recorded yesterday at a place called Yampi Sound in the Kimberley region of WA, where it hit 41.6 degrees. Now, once verified, that's going to formally happen today. This temperature will surpass the old Australian winter high of 41.2 degrees, which happened at West Roebuck, also in WA, back in August 2020. Now, while it isn't quite that hot elsewhere, we are seeing records for August temps being broken as well in New South Wales, the Northern Territory, South Australia and Queensland. Helen, we're in New South Wales. We live in Sydney, and for the last few days it's been pretty warm. Looking ahead at the temperatures, it's staying in the mid-20s, which, you know, is lovely. It's sunny, it's beautiful, but it's the end of winter. It doesn't feel quite right, does it, to have such warm weather right now? The BOM, the Bureau of Meteorology, has made comments saying, look, winter's effectively over. We might still get some cooler days and blasts here and there, but in terms of the warmer weather, it's pretty much here to stay.
And Donald Trump is threatening to pull out of the September 10 presidential debate against Kamala Harris as both sides fight over microphones. Harris's campaign wants to have the mics of both candidates on and live throughout the entire debate, as has historically been the case between presidential debates. But Trump is taking issue with that approach after he and Biden agreed to have them muted during their June debate.
We agreed to the same rules. I don't know. It doesn't matter to me. I'd rather have it probably on, but the agreement was that it would be the same as it was last time. In that case, it was muted. I didn't like it the last time, but it worked out fine.
Yeah, sorry for the ringing phone in that one. We don't have the power to get rid of that. That was Trump's fault for speaking over a ringing phone. But apparently, Harris wants to be able to rebut and fact-check Trump in real time. So she doesn't want, one has a go, then the other has a go. She wants them both to be able to have open dialogue. You might remember back in 2020 when Joe Biden and Donald Trump had their first presidential debate. It was an absolute disaster. They were yelling over the top of each other. You could not take anything away from either side except that it was very heated and they hated each other. That's all you could get from it. So that's why this decision came in where it was like, we're going to mute, which is ridiculous because presidents should be able to have formal debates where they can have a conversation and rebut each other's facts or points without it devolving into a shouting match. So that's why that exists. Look, also worth noting, the former president has taken to Truth Social seemingly to threaten pulling out of the debate. And this is all over the network it's being hosted on, ABC. Trump told followers to, quote, stay tuned. So we'll see if anything happens with that.
Yeah, look, I think they should be unmuted personally because I agree. If you can't have a debate and talk like adults and not scream over the top of each other, then what are you doing running for president? And I also think I would like to see if they can do it with them unmuted because I think that'll say a lot.
Well, I think the problem is Trump's already proven that he can't. So, I think the frustrating thing, I know we're not American. We can look back at this and kind of have a bit of a giggle. If this was the two, people wanting to be the leaders of the country that I live in, it would really frustrate me not being able to have them actually articulate what their policies are and what they want to do. It would frustrate me to no end to hear them yelling at each other. I would rather there be rules in place so that they can have an effective debate rather than just scream at each other. But it's a new nomination with Kamala, so maybe it'll be a different vibe. I doubt it. But yeah, time will tell. That's not far away. That's a couple of weeks away, so plenty to look forward to. Helen, thanks so much for being here for the headlines. Next up, we're doing a deep dive into the census and whether it should be asking about our sexuality.
Hey, Bension here. How much should the government know about our lives? Most people are pretty comfortable filling out the parts of a census that ask where you live, what kind of work you do, that kind of thing. It gets complicated when the government asks more personal questions. But LGBTIQA+ advocates have been urging the government and the Australian Bureau of Statistics for years to include questions about people's sexuality, as well as their gender, sex and sexual characteristics in the next census. Why? They argue that queer people are severely overrepresented in poor mental and physical health outcomes, and without that fine-grained data, the government just can't know what it needs to know about us to deliver the best services to improve those outcomes. Since the last census, the ABS has been running a consultation process about what will be included in the next one. So it came as a shock to advocates in recent days when they heard in the media that the next census will not include the kinds of questions they believe are vital to better health for queer Australians. Nicky Barth is the Chief Executive Officer of LGBTIQ+ Health. Nicky, welcome to the briefing. Why should the census ask every Australian if they're gay?
When you make it so simple as to the question of are you gay, you do make it sound so simple. And it's not as simple as that. What we're actually wanting to ask the Australian population is their sex, gender, whether they have been told that they have variations of sex characteristics, and their sexual orientation. And the reason that we would like those questions to be asked is because of the data that those questions will produce. And it's that data that gets used by governments, by bureaucrats, by private companies, to be able to plan for the future and to be able to respond to what the data from the census says.
The census already asks us so many questions about our lives. Why doesn't it ask us about these questions?
So the census evolves actually over time, and each round for the census, there's a call for consideration of what new topics need to go into the census. So you may recall that in the last census in 2021, there were new questions that went in looking at chronic health. And that's because it's, being decided that it's important to include those questions because of the data that those questions will then enable us to have access to. So for over a decade now, people have been working to get good sex, gender, variations of sex characteristics and sexual orientation questions into the census. We failed in 2021. What we did get from that census was known as the 2020 standard, which is the ABS set of variables. It's a set of 4 questions. It's the best way that we have at the moment to ask questions on sex, gender, variations of sex characteristics and sexual orientation. And where we find ourselves is the announcement through Sky News that the government is not going to be including those questions in the 2026 census. Sadly for us, then, that also means that it will be now 2032. So we would be looking at 2033 as the nearest opportunity into the future where we would get the benefit of this much needed important data.
What has the government told you about why it won't do this in the next census?
At the moment, we don't have rationale as to why that decision was made. And I'm expecting over the coming days that, and hope very much, that we will be able to understand why the government made this decision. What I do know is that the need for this data, there is sufficient evidence to demonstrate why we need the data. And so I'm unclear as to why, particularly when this is part of the Labour Party platform for the inclusion of this data in the census. This is something that they've said that they would do. We don't know as to why they've backtracked on that.
There could be obvious unintended consequences of this. If you're, say, an 18-year-old living with a homophobic family trying desperately to stay safe by keeping your sexuality a secret, wouldn't questions like this force someone like that to either lie on a government form or risk their personal safety?
I think you raise a really important point in that. There's no guarantee, though, for anyone completing the census that the way in which somebody answers the question is going to be truthful. I mean, there are many questions that people are uncomfortable with in the census. I know that people feel uncomfortable telling the government, for example, how much money they earn, talking about religion. There's a whole range of questions that go into the census that people aren't comfortable with. We would never be expecting anyone to risk their safety in regards to answering those questions. There are, in those questions, opportunities for people to say prefer not to say. And I do understand that that could be a bit of an indicator in a family scenario if a young person did say that they would prefer not to answer that question. And people may go with what's safe for them. And so in the case of sexual orientation, may mark the box that they're heterosexual. That, though, shouldn't stop us from moving forward with the inclusion of these questions because, by and large, the majority of the data that we would capture would be reliable data, and we can't put the risk of not getting that really meaningful data because some of the questions that may be answered aren't 100% accurate. It's the case for every question in the census.
Accuracy is one thing, but personal safety is quite another because it's not quite the same, is it, to ask how much money you earn, and people might be embarrassed about that, as to ask a teenager, for example, about their sexuality.
These questions are asked in other census in other countries. So we know that the UK include these questions. They may not include the variations of sex characteristics question. I know that they did in New Zealand in their last census, as well as sex, gender and sexual orientation questions. And over time, people will get used to answering these questions. And part of what the ABS undertakes is education for community when there's new topics. And part of that education will be able to sort of tackle some of these issues to create safer environments for the way in which the census would have been delivered. So it's not just the census rocks up on, in your post box in time for you to be able to complete it on census night with no other information. There would have been education campaigns around this. But I know that in the UK, for example, every time you go to see a GP, you're asked a question on your sexual orientation and the sky hasn't fallen in. There would have been teething problems, in rolling that out. But over time, then they're not unusual questions. They just become a set of questions that sit within demographics. And times are changing. Young people are doing a great job in talking about sexual orientation and gender. And over time in society, we will look back in the future on this decision and wonder why on earth it was made.
Is the LGBTIQA plus community in Australia speaking with one voice on this?
I think we have a majority voice on this. I do know that there are some people in our communities that are worried about sharing this information with government. And I think for some older people, it can be worrying about, particularly given history, particularly for gay men, where homosexuality was a crime. But the other side of that, for example, I know that in the 2021 scenario, and we were advocating there, that a politician did receive a letter from an older constituent who had said, please work to get these questions in the census because I won't be alive for the 2026 census and I really want to be able to tick that important box. So I think what we can say is some people will be uncomfortable, but over time, again, when people understand even more so the importance of those questions and what we've seen to the government's decision to not include these questions are a number of very disappointed, angry, and people feel betrayed by the decision.
You mentioned that it's important to get this kind of data at that granular level. What are we missing out on? What would we know? And what kind of outcomes could we expect if we had this data in the future?
That population level data is really important to tell us this is what the lay of the land looks like now. PHNs, the primary health networks that deliver all of the primary care across each of their sort of geographical areas, they really rely on that population level data to decide how to commission services, where to invest, and to be able to look at service gaps so that those service gaps can be filled. So without that data, we don't have this baseline understanding of where we live. We would also be able to understand the chronic health issues. We don't have that level of granular data at the moment. But importantly, one of the issues with regards to the health disparities that LGBTIQ plus people are living with is poor mental health and well-being. What we will be able to see from the census is that granular kind of data in regards to employment, income, education background of people, where we're living, how we're living, who we're living with. And all of those things are the things that we talk about when we talk about the social determinants of health. And we know that we have high rates of homelessness, for example. We would be able to see some of this in the census. We would know where we're living in aged care so that we can target aged care services to do a better job. At the moment, we're throwing a very thin net, and I say thin because resources are so scarce, across the entire country. What the census would enable us to do is have a magnifying glass across the country to say, this is where we have significant population and where we should be investing these scarce resources. We just don't have that lens at the moment. And so what we see is waste. What we see is potentially then duplication. And so economically, asking these questions is really important because we will be investing the right number of resources in the right place at the right time, and we're not doing that at the moment.
What would be your final message to the government now that this decision has been made?
I would ask the government to go back and look at the evidence as to why we need these questions, and to reconsider. And I would also be asking the government to ensure that the next 10-year National Action Plan for the health and wellbeing of LGBTIQ plus people is extraordinarily robust, well supported and well resourced, so that in the gap of not being able to have access to this data, that we are able to deliver the best health and wellbeing services for LGBTIQ plus people across Australia.
Nicky Barth, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Nicky Barth there. The Australian Bureau of Statistics and the Treasurer, who's responsible for the ABS, didn't immediately respond to our request for comment. We'll update you if we hear back. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. Before you go though, if you found this episode interesting, please share a link with a friend. If you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. We'll be back in your feed with another episode this afternoon from 3. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you next time.
Listener.